All right, we're going to get started. This is the webinar on workplace data science, and we're going to be talking specifically about a very key issue today, which is meeting rooms and some data that goes into understanding how they can be used and be more effective. So, Sean, let's get this started here. My name is Ari, and I am Director of Market Research here at Density, which means I'm really understanding how the world of work and workplace is changing. And I'm joined by Sean, and he's actually working from home. So Sean, maybe we'll also be joined by your cat. Is that right? Can you say hi?
That could be. If anyone hears purring, my cat's near the microphone. It's not me.
And Sean, what's your role at Density?
I'm the senior data scientist here. And just like Ari, I try to understand how people use workspace.
Cool. Yeah, data science is a very interesting thing, and I've learned a lot from working with Sean, and I hope you guys will too. So let's get started. We are going to talk a little bit about density as context, and so you'll know who we are. Then we're going to do a demo led by Sean, which is really cool. We're going to look at how is data collected and how can you have an analytical framework for thinking about workplace data. And then we're going to talk about specifically some of our findings and some ways of thinking about this collaborative space of meeting rooms, and then give you some tips about getting started in your own organization and take your questions. Quick note, we have shared with you that we're going to be giving away $20 gift cards to Amazon. Really cool. To meet that requirement, you need to have sent us a work email, be in the corporate real estate, and stay for the entirety of the webinar. So without further ado, a little bit about density. We build the most advanced people counting sensor. And so the device here, which you see on the left, is installed above a doorway or a threshold. And it uses infrared light to capture how many people are entering and exiting a space. So it's recording occupancy by aggregating all of these different sensors across a building or room or floor to really understand in real time, every second of the day, how many people are entering and how many people are here. It's not a camera, so it's not trying to identify personally identifiable information, which is a real issue in the workplace. And it's also scalable enough that you can integrate it with different systems. And we'll be talking about some of the actual analytics today. And 3 things to remember about this actual device is that it's accurate, anonymous, and real time. So just to summarize, we build this people counting sensor, both the hardware and the software. And with the data that collects, you can do really cool things, which we'll talk about today, and some of the implications. So some of the big clients that we serve, we have very large corporate real estate, we have different universities, and we have different players from different types of organizations, but with a real focus on workplace. And one thing that's really interesting, although these different companies are different, they have one thing in common, which they have a lot of real estate, and they want to maximize that real estate, both in terms of the experience and security, but also in terms of cost efficiencies. And so in order to do that, you increasingly need more data and more relevant and real-time data. And we're installed across very large companies. Here we have 100 million square feet of corporate real estate that we're measuring, and 50 million people every day. So let's talk about a little bit more on the next slide here. Why would you want to count people in the workplace? And we're going to start with that as a way of understanding, framing some data that goes into meeting rooms specifically. But it comes down to these 3 things. Employee experience. So once you know how your employees are using your space, you can help them access the spaces that they need in real time. You can understand what they actually need and what they don't. When they come into the office, what amenities they use. It's more data for a better experience. Space efficiency, there's a huge shift right now towards densification of saying we want to consolidate our real estate. We've worked with some of the largest real estate teams, corporate real estate, one of the largest telecom companies in the world. They were trying to consolidate their space. And they were trying to think about how do we do this in a way that isn't going to upset our employees, but also is going to help us actually get ahead of our leases and understand which leases to keep and not, and how to use data to do that. And then reduce costs. So there's always this drive towards being more efficient. And now in the age, especially when real estate costs are going through the roof, they're higher than they've ever been, especially in major cities. I'm here out of San Francisco. I can relate to that personally. And there's really this drive to have more data to make more informed decisions that are going to be better for the bottom line as well as the employee. So what does this mean in terms of how we should be thinking about and what our best clients are doing with data? And this is very a kind of a simple idea, but it's really important as we look at meeting rooms in different spaces within an organization. So you want to establish effective standards as you grow or shrink. So organizations are like organisms. They're always growing and shrinking in terms of headcount, in terms of where people are located, in terms of how teams are structured. And so the key is to really understand, what do my own employees, not employees that I've read about in Fast Company that are at co-working or using desks a certain way or hot desking. It's really about what do my own employees need and how do I get the data to do that? So our best clients actively measure and monitor utilization rates, how their spaces are used on a floor level, on a room level. And they know things like how many people are actually coming to work today, how much square feet they actually need to support that growth, or if they're consolidating, how to support that, how many additional people they can assign to specific areas or zones, how they can allocate space to growing teams. So they want to do this on a room level. They want to understand neighborhoods or desk areas. And they want to correct for the moving targets and not just go after the guesswork or the politics or these trends of remote work or whatever it may be. So it's really about getting data to provide the fundamental infrastructure for your workplace planning and consolidation or growth efforts. And on the right, we have a look at a dashboard that is showing how you can start to think about the square foot per person as you're scaling or not. And with that, I'm going to segue to Sean, who's going to show us how do we actually think about taking these big ideas of understanding how data should operate in the workplace to actually look at what it looks like in real life with some of this data.
Sure, and I'd like to start by just showing you what our dashboard looks like, where we got that screenshot you saw on the last slide. This is what it looks like if you instrument your spaces with density sensors. Once they're outfitted, you get real-time data, roll-ups, historical data, whatever's important for your use case here in custom-built dashboards that we can customize to your exact specifications for your use case, for your needs, to deliver that value, boom, as soon as you land in the density dashboard. An exciting new feature for drilling down and exploring data and looking at very granular information is our space analytics feature. This is brand new, just launched last month, available to everyone that uses density. And this is looking at those same conference rooms we were just looking at in the dashboard. But now I have a whole bunch of filters and I can explore the data interactively. It's almost instantaneous. It's really amazing and lots of fun for someone like me to look through here. What I'm looking at right now is just one metric. It's occupancy. I can also look at utilization, how many seats are open, how many visitors a space has to see foot traffic. If I flip over utilization, I can see there's quite the variance in these conference rooms. I have 6 of them brought up here. I could show any across my whole portfolio worldwide. These are in 2 different cities entirely. I think one's in Dallas and some are in New York. Some conference rooms are overutilized, 167% at peak. Some are underutilized, peaking at just 1/3 of their expected capacity. This is the type of insight we look for across our portfolio to give insight to drive those business decisions. I'm just going to tweak a couple of the features here to show how powerful this view is and how that instant feedback loop and interactivity is really key. So you see these dips, that stands out to me really quickly. Saturday and Sunday, of course, no one's in the office. So I'm going to filter those days out. I just hit apply, and now we just see weekdays. That's important stuff. I see dips still on the 1st and the 25th of December. Of course, okay, those are holidays. That is easy to explain. But what are these other peaks? I might have a good insight. I know on January 9th, we had an all hands meeting, 200% attendance. We're overstuffed in a couple of these conference rooms, but we're still seeing underutilization in others like 4C, 4A. Wow, those numbers are really low. We can probably consolidate those on the floors that they're on, or maybe think about outfitting them with more equipment. Perhaps they don't have TVs or projectors. That's why folks aren't using them. This is a great starting point for investigating what's going on with the spaces at the individual space level, as well as comparing across the portfolio any spaces or space types I'm interested in. And again, there's several metrics I can plot here, looking at the exact occupancy. Let's say this last 7 days down to the 15-minute interval, and we see very granular information, how many people are in each room all throughout the day. This can drive some really cool insight. If we know a little bit more about how the spaces are being used, we can make really, really smart decisions about how to consolidate, how to expand, and make amenities decisions. So I think this really illustrates the power of the tool, the power of the insights the tools can provide, both the dashboard and our new space analytics feature. We looked at this at a really, really large fleet-wide level at millions of square feet of conference rooms to find some really fascinating insights that we put into that report. And I'm going to let Ari touch on what the big takeaways are from looking at space at that level.
Great. So just a couple quick things, Sean, with what you just shared with us. I noticed that you had the conference rooms, and today we're talking about meeting rooms, but there was also in that tool a lot of different ways that you could look at buildings or floors or even desk areas and understand those specific spaces. So we're going to talk specifically about this question of how do people meet right now and look at those meeting rooms as Sean showed us. But I do want to just have a quick little asterisk that if you do want to understand how your buildings are used, how specific amenities or cafes are used, or desk areas in neighborhoods, those are all things that you can do once you have the sensors deployed. But for the purposes of this webinar, let's get to how do people meet. So Sean and I wanted to understand, especially in the world of collaboration that we're always hearing about, okay, workplaces today need to be social environments. That's why people come to work. It's the one thing you can do that you can't do anywhere else is meet with people face to face. So we looked at 11,800 hours of data across 60 locations, across in aggregate all of those conference rooms. And we looked at by client, we looked at in a large kind of trend analysis, what do we actually see here? And we put together a report, we co-authored a report, and then we actually got some publication in Work Design and a couple other trade publications, and you can download the report. And we're going to show you what some of the findings were of this actual data with meeting rooms. So number one, we found that across all of these spaces and over a 6-month period, we found that meeting rooms were consistently used by just one person. So when we look at the number of meetings, and then we look at how many people are there in that meeting, well, a lot of time it's just one person. So you might ask, well, is that even a meeting? Well, the answer is it could be that they're doing a video conference and they need a smaller space and there's not phone booths. Or it could be in the world of the open office, there's some issues that are raised that we'll talk about in a moment that are changing how meeting rooms are being used. So let's go to the next slide here because I think it encapsulates it. So when we looked at all of the meeting rooms, so hundreds of different conference rooms of many different sizes, we found that one person, 36% of the time they were in use, they were being used just by one person. And then when you look at the next most common meeting room size when they're actually being used is 2 to 4 people. So we're seeing, even though the standards for conference rooms tend to be a lot larger, and we did research on that as well, and you can find that in a report, the real takeaway here is that, oh my God, people are using their meeting rooms as private offices. And that was a huge takeaway for us. And so here's what we did with it. Well, we went to a conference, Future Offices, and I led a workshop with over 30 corporate real estate leaders, many like yourself. We have many on the phone right now listening to us with this webinar, and those were some of the people that actually came to our workshop, and we shared with them this data. We showed that over 30% of the time, meeting rooms are being used just by one person, and then 2 to 4 is very common as well. And here's what they said to us. Well, this is something we're not surprised by because we're seeing in our own organizations with their own data that, for example, density can provide, that there's issues with lack of privacy, lack of really understanding guidelines for how spaces are planned, and ongoing data collection. So they're also seeing that, in this open office environment, people are retreating into the conference rooms and kind of taking them hostage and monopolizing them because they need an open space. So what we did was we shared with them this data, and we said, what would you do with this data? How would you change your space planning, maybe your leases or your workplace in general? And here's what they did. One of the groups here shared with us that they would have, as you can see, a lot more phone booths, privacy booths, and that's a big trend today. And this is why. They also had a lot more 2 to 4 person booths and huddle spaces. And then they had larger spaces that can actually expand or contract. So let's imagine a room for 10 people, but that had a divider in the middle. Now, that's not always the case. There's many times rooms that are needed for larger meetings, but this was some of the creativity that they came up with once they were looking at that data. So you could look at this and say, okay, great. What would be the standards for all workplaces with some of this data? So let's see what that might look like. Well, if you were to take this data and say, okay, in aggregate, how would you design a space or do allocation of space that would align with some of this data? Here's what you might do. You might have, for every 3 phone booths or areas for 1 person, you would have 4 rooms for 2 to 4 people, 1 for 5 to 6, and then 2 for 10 to 20, 2 flexible 20-person rooms that could be converted to 2 rooms. So this is pretty cool because we're using data science to allocate space and we're thinking about it strategically. However, I will put a big kind of asterisk here, which is that the whole point of this is not to just adopt another white paper finding or adopt another trend analysis. It's that once you have your own data and you can see how your own organizations are using space differently, then you can start to do these type of standards for yourself and get on top of decisions like leases or guidelines for how all of your meeting rooms should be created and how they can be adjusted over time. Just to give you a quick story here, we were working with a client and they found that their sales organization was using their workplaces, their desks, and their meeting rooms so differently than their engineers, which makes sense, but they had the data to then go and allocate and change the size of desks and allocation of desks, and then the types of meeting rooms. And some happen to be more client-facing and larger, and for the engineers, there were more huddle rooms for stand-ups and things like that. So we've now looked at data. We've looked at what it means for your own organization when you look at it yourself in our dashboard, when you have these sensors. Then we've looked at, on a macro level, what some of these findings can entail. So now let's get a little bit more of a fluency with how you actually go about collecting this data. So let's say you're on the phone right now. We have a lot of participants from very large organizations. They're hearing that they should be doing sensors, that they should have different types of technology, and they're trying to figure out what should I be putting in and why. So what you want to be doing is you need to know how many people are using different spaces and make sure that you can measure the spaces that matter to you. So our approach at Density is that we are not a camera. We have accurate anonymous people count that is, as you can see here, as people are entering and exiting the threshold, the actual computer on the device, it's using computer vision and algorithms to say, okay, that is a human walking in, and it ignores everything else. So all those fun buzzwords of machine learning and onboard deep learning, this is what it means. It's able to actually recognize what is a human and what isn't without collecting any personally identifiable information. And that's our unique approach. And we built that technology from the ground up. And we believe that's how you should go about this. And we'll tell you a little bit more about it. So on the next slide here, a little bit about us at Density. So we're thinking about how do you go about collecting this data? I'm excited to get started and think about my own meeting rooms. Here's some of the things you should be thinking about. Number one is privacy. So you want to make sure that you're not collecting person identifiable information in an office environment, or you're doing so in a compliant way. Security, how accurate. So you can find things that are aggregate of heat maps, but if you really want to know how are different spaces actually being used and understand over and under capacity, things like that, you need actual accuracy to solve for these use cases. And then, of course, data availability. So integrations, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in the next 2 slides. So we've now talked a lot about meeting rooms. We now know that they're underutilized in some ways because they're being used a lot by one person. And they need to be rearranged based on team and need to be measured to your own organization. So how do you go about actually finding some of this granular data? Well, what's really cool is that you can actually measure meeting room utilization and understand what counts as a meeting by integrating with all of your room booking data. So this is kind of the cherry on top here. But if you're collecting meeting room data with our sensors, then you can also go about it by also understanding how many people are actually reserving a space but not showing up, and letting employees know when a space is actually available to go and meet based on how many people are there, if it's being used by a certain amount. So let's go on the next slide here too. We can show you now, once you get that, we've looked at the data, we've looked at the meeting room kind of trends and the meeting room size, you can start to really understand, okay, what's our typical meeting room size here? How are these different conference rooms performing versus another? What are the different meetings that are taking place? And then also, how do we change behavior? So when someone books a room using, let's say, like a Google Calendar, but they don't show up, you need to know that. Or if they book a room for just one person, but it's a room for 20, or if they don't book it at all, that's all data that you can need to take action. So, what does this actually mean for your organization? You have these meeting rooms, people complain, and now you can get started to actually measure how they're being used and make them better assets by integrating directly into the infrastructure of your meeting rooms that you already have. So how to get started? Just a quick note, we are doing a special promotion, 10% off an enterprise agreement for orders that come in by the end of the month, and specifically for these live webinar attendees. So that's something else that we're offering in addition to that gift card as a thank you. But really the reason why is because we know that it's important to get started, and that our clients, once they have these type of the type of sensors deployed, then they can really start and do the fun things that Sean and I told you about today that are changing how they're thinking about their workplace. So it includes with just when you think about density, often on these webinars, we get asked, what does it actually mean in terms of getting started? Well, you have access to the data, you have these devices, and the support that you need to get started in the integrations. And then you can go about with your IT team or however you do it, installing them. We're happy to talk to you more about that, how to actually get started and where you can find that. So we are really wanting people to get started with these sensors, and look at the spaces that matter to them in an ongoing basis, because that is the future of workplace data science. It's using data to change how we think about and adjust to the needs of both the people and the building. So without further ado, we're going to take some of your questions here. And I have them here, and I will read them out, and then Sean, we can both chime in accordingly as we go. Sure. So one question was, how do you have more than 100% utilization? And this was asked by Shruti Shrikar. So thank you for asking that. And maybe Sean, you can speak to that.
Absolutely. So we set a target utilization for each space. For a conference room, that might be 6, 8, 12 people. We also have the idea of a legal limit on spaces where we're interested in, what's the fire code limit, the absolute upper bound. With those two targets in mind, we can calculate utilization. So if there's 5 people in a space and we set the target utilization at 10, it's 50% utilized. If there's 12 people in that same space, then it's 120% utilized. I hope that answers the question, at least as far as our charts and metrics go. That's how we calculate utilization.
Yep. So one thing to keep in mind in what we've seen, Shruti, with our largest clients, is they have some certain understandings of how they're allocating space to certain needs or capacities. So they will maybe say, okay, well, in this room, we want it to have a capacity of a certain amount because that's the purpose of this room. It's meant to meet the needs of 10 people. Or we have put out all of the FF&E, the furnitures and fixtures and equipment for 10 people. So it's really important to know when you're not meeting that need, and that data can help you either change that current space or help develop your standards accordingly. So you can go over utilization in the same way you can go over capacity of any space. It's just about understanding when that happens and understanding the highs and lows, peaks and valleys to make some of those changes. Does the system count people leaving the conference room? And that's asked by Sunny. So Sean, can you answer maybe about how it is tracking entrances and exits?
Absolutely. In brief, as we saw with the video earlier, we track people as they enter and exit. That +1, that -1 as people enter and exit a space allows us to track the occupancy number. If we see 4 entrances and no exits, then there's 4 people in that room. If there's 1 exit, now there's 3 people, and so on. So we do track people entering and exiting, and that's how we calculate occupancy.
Great. So I can see your questions here. There's a lot of different ones coming in, and it's pretty exciting to see that there's all these questions. So we urge you to, if you haven't asked a question yet, please feel free to do so. So someone said here that they appreciate the webinar and all of the robust data. And then what is the specific advantage of and use case for density sensors, considering that you can get some of this aggregate data of how conference rooms are underutilized or not at scale. So the specific advantage of density, I'll talk about specifically for meeting rooms and then at large. So with meeting rooms, you need to understand how are meeting rooms being used at every moment of the day and understand what constitutes a meeting so that you can start to see, okay, what are typical meeting room sizes? That's when you're creating standards. So to do that, you need to know ongoing basis, how are these meeting rooms being used, and be able to kind of aggregate them in general to say, hey, we have a group of these type of meeting rooms, and here's what a typical day looks like, or here's specifically how they're being used versus how they're being reserved or being booked. In order to do that, you need real-time ongoing traffic and foot traffic detection and monitoring to know how the space is being used. It's not just about, okay, there's some sort of a heat movement here. It's really understanding depth of how many people are entering and exiting the space. And then the second thing is we can do some really cool integrations with the meeting room specifically that enable some really cool value of knowing how meeting rooms that are being reserved or booked actually correlate to real life data. But that's just one part of the corporate real estate kind of footprint that density helps with. If you're interested, we can reach out more, but I would urge you to look at how we think about the desks use. So we have a neighborhood solution, which helps you understand how many people are using our desks as we're thinking about things like hoteling and desk allocation, and how are those being used moment to moment. Floors, how many people came on into the floor, and then when they did that, did they maybe go into the conference room or go to their desks? In aggregate, we can start to get that picture. And then in the building level, so in real time, how many people are coming in the space or going to the cafeteria. So it's really about taking a data-driven approach to the problems that you're already solving so that you can do your job better. So whether you're in space planning or you're in facilities or you're on a lease and real estate team, you need data to drive those decisions, and density has the granularity, accuracy, and ongoing data collection to do that. So we have a couple other questions, which is great. So keep them coming. We have, in your pricing model, the sensors are sold or leased. Are they sold or leased? Yeah, so our pricing model, look, if you have a question about the pricing model, it's great. And I see that someone's anonymous here. I would urge you to just get in touch because we can explain how that all works at a high level. It's very similar to kind of like a cell phone where you have the hardware device and then you pay for access to the value of the network and the analytics and the actual access of the actual data. So it's similar in that way where we have flexible pricing structures that can be helpful in that way. So if you're trying to optimize for OpEx or CapEx, just talk to us and we can help out. Does data from the sensors use the customer's network? Great question by Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. So the density sensors need to be connected to the internet. That is how we're able to do this really complex computer vision that allows for accurate count. And the way that we have seen that work the best is it can either go through power over Ethernet, or it could be connected through an adapter through a regular outlet and connected over Wi-Fi. The other thing to keep in mind is in some rare conditions, we've also been able to do other types of 4G networks or things like that. But it really is about your organization. One thing I will note is at the heart of that question sometimes is, can I trust an IoT device on my network? And is it something that's okay to do in my organization? The answer is yes. We've been installed with some very large financial institutions We have vetted InfoSec processes. So if that's the concern, we can allay them. Because the data is anonymous, we can be installed on your network and talk through it if that's a challenge. Yeah, so we have, you mentioned Google Calendars. Is there an existing density Google Calendar interface? Yeah, so basically the way that we were showing it, thanks Sean, this is actually collecting data from a meeting room system, and then it's aggregating these exact dashboards. So on the right here, Sean, can you just explain kind of like some of these charts and how we're able to interlay that?
Absolutely. So we can pull data from Robin, Comfy, Condeco, Team, Google Calendar, and Outlook. Those are our two most popular, to pull down the booking information for the rooms in question, and then produce several different report types that we can integrate with your customized dashboard. They can show everything from booking behavior, as we discussed and Ari went over, to say who was booking lots of rooms, who was not attending meetings, and so on, for the behavior side. And we can also show, as our report did, and we discussed at the outset, the meeting size. How big are the meetings scheduled versus how big are the meetings actually being attended in real life? And also we can plot those out day to day. So you can kind of get your arms around how big are the meetings, when are the big meetings happening, or are there lots of small ones, and kind of get a feel for the behavior there. I think they're pretty well split between behavioral and analytical, and we can offer solutions for both. Of course, we can also, now that we have that data and we've now integrated, we can build out some really cool custom reports, case by case. So get in touch with us and see what we can do.
And one other question here that's related to that is that we've been talking a lot about historical and insights, but how do you actually go about looking at the real-time data? So that's a great question. And what we can do is, we're talking a lot about driving these decisions, these large strategic decisions, but on a day-to-day level, we actually have, we can integrate into actual workplace apps, or we have our own that allow you to see in real time how many spots are available, where are some of the actual busyness of different rooms or parts of your campus or your office. So that's, if you want to know about that specifically and you have some of those initiatives and you're trying to think about for your employees, we've had clients who are really focused on that part of the employee experience and making sure they can solve it that way. Please reach out as well. So it looks like we are going to be wrapping up right now. I will say that we understand that this is a complex kind of world of sensorification, and a lot of people in corporate real estate, when I go to these events, are feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling like there's a lot of different solutions. They're feeling like they really just want to make their lives easier. And so Sean and I have definitely shown you a lot of different exciting things, but at the root of this is we need to be able to use data to help make your jobs easier. So if you can find specific things in your plate that you believe can be solved with data, or they're currently too much solved by guesswork, or you're trying to figure out what people actually want versus what they complain about and what they need. These are really human problems, and you can actually use data and data science to help with those problems today. So please reach out. We want to be helpful, and we know that as you think about your overall strategy, data and sensors can help and be a way to get what you need done. So thank you very much for your time. I know it's middle of the day for some of you, or the beginning, but we really appreciate it. And please feel free to reach out and continue the conversation. We'll share this presentation as well as the report that we mentioned. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.